Some crises don't announce themselves with a sudden, deafening explosion. They don't arrive in, one big moment that captures all the headlines. No, some of them, they just sort of leak out slowly over years. It might start with a quiet text message or a single lawsuit that gets ignored, a senior resignation letter filed late at night. It's a pattern of employee testimony, just whispers of a warning that, well, when you zoom out and you give it time, it reveals a clear, undeniable, and frankly, a very disturbing shape. Today, we are stepping back from that daily news cycle. We're looking beyond the immediate political fights to recognize the full shape of a crisis that has been building for nearly a decade inside the Circuit Court Clerk's office. And with the May primary and the August countywide election just ahead, you deserve the full historical picture, not just the recent headlines.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is part 2 of our investigation into the long-running crisis inside the Circuit Court Clerk's office. If you're just joining us in part 1, we really laid the foundation.
We walk through the symptoms that have strained the entire court system and really shaped the lives of countless employees. We saw the pattern of lawsuits, the huge employee turnover stats, the documented retaliation, the political pressure, and all that testimony describing a culture where fear had just replaced genuine, stable leadership. We argued that these were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a much deeper systemic problem. Today, in part 2, our mission is to move past those symptoms and uncover the historical receipts. We're diving deep into internal documents because the issues people are talking about today, the failures, the hostility, the mismanagement, they didn't just start recently. They have been building, they've been documented and detailed for nearly 10 years. And understanding that timeline and the documented proof of how long it's been going on, that is crucial context as you prepare to vote.
It really is. And the historical documents we're focusing on today are, well, they're unique for a couple of reasons. First, they were not created for anyone on the outside. They weren't designed for a press release or, crafted for some campaign flyer. This wasn't for social media spin. And second, they were created by people inside the office at the time, specifically for survival. And to establish an irrefutable historical record, we're synthesizing information from 2 key internal documents. First, a clinically detailed fact sheet that was compiled by insiders who were just trying to document what they had experienced and witnessed. And second, we have a very detailed written account from a former chief deputy clerk. It's titled, "This is My Story," and was written way back in 2017. And that's the important distinction we have to emphasize. These documents matter now because they reveal consistency, longevity. They show that the operational and ethical issues were absolutely systemic and structural. They weren't sudden recent events, and they certainly weren't the invention of a current political challenger. The rot, as we're about to show, had already set in years before this current election cycle even began.
Okay, so let's unpack that first piece of evidence, the FASI-T sheet. As you mentioned, this document, it reads less like some emotional expose and more like a forensic audit summary.
It's very clinical.
Yeah, it's concise, almost detached, and that lack of emotional pleading is exactly what makes this list of allegations so incredibly powerful. It's a summary of what employees had been experiencing for years inside that building. The fact sheet gives us a detailed 9-point breakdown of systemic allegations from that time. It covers everything from legal liability to, basic operational competency. Let's start with the hard, measurable metric that should really concern every taxpayer: lawsuits and legal liability. The document details five separate lawsuits involving the clerk, Melissa Harrell, in a really short span of time.
And when you look at how a constitutional office should operate, 5 lawsuits in a relatively brief tenure is a massive red flag. The documentation itself even notes that this is, and I'm quoting, more than any predecessor. That's a remarkable level of legal vulnerability and liability for the county. But it's not just the number of them that matters. The FASI-T sheet meticulously details the consistency of the allegations across all 5 cases.
Right. What were they?
Discrimination, retaliation, hostile work environment, or misuse of office. It's the same themes over and over again.
So it's a clear pattern.
A very clear pattern. And you have to think about the legal and financial context here. Each one of these lawsuits, regardless of the outcome, it costs the county money.
For lawyers, for settlements.
Exactly, for defense, for settlements, and for all that staff time that's diverted to depositions and meetings.
Yeah.
And the consistency of claims, retaliation, and hostility, that suggests the problem isn't the employees. The problem is the environment that these lawsuits are describing. It's a pattern confirmed through multiple formal legal proceedings across multiple years.
And if that consistent legal liability captures the financial risk, well, the second point in the FASI-T sheet captures the human cost. staff exodus. The document highlights a concrete, just a staggering metric, a 54% turnover rate starting in 2014.
That statistic, 54% turnover. It's not just high. It signals an operational disaster.
Right. I mean, what's normal for an office like this?
Well, in a stable civil service environment, anything over, say, 10 to 15% would be concerning. 54% means this office was functional hemorrhaging staff. We really need to dissect what a number like that actually implies for the court system.
Okay.
When you lose that much stat, you are losing institutional knowledge. You're losing the long-term employees who know where the critical documents are, who understand the complex historical cases, who know the nuances of state law. And the loss of that expertise, it leads to massive delays and, crucially, errors in processing court documents. And that impacts every attorney, every judge, and every single citizen who relies on those records being accurate.
So beyond losing that institutional memory, what's the sheer cost of replacing over half of your workforce? It has to be enormous.
Oh, the financial burden is immense. You have the direct cost of continuous recruitment, right? The expense of training new employees,
Who might just leave in 6 months anyway.
who may only stay 6 months before they're completely overwhelmed, yes. And then there's the security risk of having constant churn in an office that handles sensitive personal and legal documentation. And it forces the remaining staff, the ones who manage to stick around, into this cycle of constant, exhausting training, which only accelerates their burnout and feeds right back into that high turnover rate. It signals a complete and total collapse of stability and internal management.
And that leads right into the next point, which kind of explains the why behind that turnover rate. Point 3 is documented hostility. The fact sheet confirms that hostile work environment complaints weren't just rumors floating around among staff. They were formally documented issues. They were in the office's HR or internal records.
So it wasn't just a feeling, it was on paper.
Exactly. And then we move to the internal operations, specifically how people got their jobs, which brings us to nepotism in hiring practices. Point 4 alleges that hiring routinely bypassed standard HR procedures entirely. Instead, hiring became reliant on personal networks, on friendships, and specifically, political loyalty.
And this is critical because it tells you exactly how the culture was being intentionally shaped. When you throw standard human resources, meritocracy, when you throw that aside, the office stops functioning as a public service institution that's accountable to performance.
Right, it becomes something else.
It transforms into a political patronage system. Employees understand implicitly that their job security rests on their political affiliation and their personal loyalty to the clerk, not on how competent they are at their job.
Yeah.
This is the essence of a loyalty test. It explains why the environment became so hostile and why retaliation became a management tool, which is exactly what the lawsuits confirmed. You staff your office with loyalists, and you push out anyone who might question the leadership.
Point 5 is one of the most sobering details in this whole document, really, because of the nature of the proof. Evidence of racial bias. The faxi sheet specifically included documentation of racist statements documented in text messages. And we need to emphasize this distinction very carefully. The sheet specifies these were not just allegations or hearsay. They had documented physical evidence in the form of screenshots.
That leap from an anecdote to documented digital evidence is crucial in a legal and ethical sense.
Absolutely.
When a third party documents screenshots of racist language being used, it confirms that the hostile work environment wasn't just, passively tolerated. It was being actively fueled by a racial bias that could be proven with permanent digital communication. And for the staff, this means that the hostility they felt wasn't just standard workplace friction. It was targeted, potentially discriminatory harassment that was provably present in communications at high levels. That level of toxicity it completely undermines morale, creates a completely indefensible legal position for the county.
Let's move to the intersection of ethics and taxpayer expense, the alleged misuse of office. Point 6 details the allegation that the clerk, Melissa Harrell, was allowed to run a private commissary business on county time and on county property.
Okay, can you explain what a commissary is for people who might not know?
Sure. A commissary is often like a small store, a little profit center, selling snacks, drinks, small convenience items. And the sheet provides specific examples of taxpayer expense supporting this private business. Supplies were ordered on county time, and crucially, the stocking of inventory and managing the business was done on county time by county employees.
Wow. I mean, that represents a fundamental breach of public trust. You could call it an ethical collapse. The core ethical principle for any public servant is that public resources, time, property, paid labor. They must be used exclusively for public benefit.
Right, for the public's business.
Yes. So using county supplies, paying county staff salaries, and dedicating official hours to run a personal profit center, that's not just an ethical oversight. It is a clear violation of the responsibility that comes with holding a constitutional office. And furthermore, it directly feeds into the problems we've already discussed, particularly chronic absenteeism and operational neglect. If the clerk's attention, and potentially the attention of key staff, is constantly divided between managing the crucial complex functions of the court and what? Managing a side business.
The main job is going to suffer.
The primary mission of the office, serving the public through the court system, will inevitably, and as we see here, demonstrably suffer.
And speaking of public image versus reality, point 7 addressed misleading campaign materials. The FACT sheet detailed claims made in campaign materials that allegedly did not align with official financial reports or, the operational reality of the office's day-to-day functions. Which brings us to points 8 and 9. And together, these two paint a really devastating picture of operational neglect from the very top. Point 8 highlights the claim of a 6-figure salary that was paired with chronic absenteeism. Employees reported that the elected official was often, quote, not present physically or otherwise.
The contrast there is just jarring.
Yeah.
And it reveals a profound lack of accountability. You're being paid a substantial public salary, which signals high responsibility, yet the evidence points to chronic physical absence.
Not there.
If the leader is consistently not present, they are not managing the operation. They're not accountable to the people working there. This non-presence forces all the pressure directly onto the deputies and the staff who are already struggling with that 54% turnover rate and the documented hostile environment. It's a classic example of a system failing from the top down due to neglect, where the person with the most responsibility is the least available to solve the massive problems outlined in the previous 7 points.
And point 9 confirms that the absence wasn't just physical, it was intellectual. The surprising finding was that multiple employees reported the clerk could not clearly explain the basic functional processes of the very office they were charged with running.
Just imagine, if you will, hiring a CEO for a major complex engineering firm who, when you ask them, they can't explain the core mechanism of the product they're selling.
Yeah, that's not a good look.
That is the level of operational void we're discussing here. You cannot fix systemic failures that you do not understand. You can't lead a complex administrative operation if you are fundamentally unaware of how it operates day to day, especially one that processes thousands of critical legal documents every year. That kind of information vacuum is exceptionally dangerous for the integrity of the community's legal records.
So, to just sort of wrap up this section and synthesize, these are not rumors that were generated in a backroom chat during an election year. These are 9 documented claims found across internal communications, employee statements, and evidence that was cited in 5 separate lawsuits. The FACT sheet, after laying out this whole operational and ethical breakdown, it ends with a very blunt and absolute conclusion. It says, it's time for Melissa Harrell to exit the building.
No ambiguity there.
None at all. So we've established this clinical audit, but numbers and bullet points, they only tell half the story. To really understand the true human cost of that environment, to move beyond the what and understand the why and the how, we need to turn to the deeply personal experience that's detailed in that 2017 account.
Yes. And this is where the story really deepens. The shift from the clinical list of the VCT sheet to the personal experience of the chief deputy clerk. It gives us the visceral texture behind all those data points. And again, what is so significant about this second document is its age. It was written nearly a decade ago in 2017. Yet as we examine it, we see that it absolutely mirrors the content of the FACT sheet, which confirms the profound longevity and consistency of this pattern of systemic toxicity.
Let's walk through the chronology that's described by the former chief deputy clerk in This Is My Story. It starts almost right away with a transactional relationship that's focused entirely on political allegiance, not professional development. They describe a rapid promotion, getting a major salary increase, not because of any standard performance review or, a merit-based process, but explicitly for political convenience. And this was at a time when the deputy was already planning to resign.
This is a perfect illustration of that internal culture we saw in the FACT sheet's nepotism section. High-level positions and significant public salaries were being used not as a reward for competence or experience, but purely as a tool to secure political allegiance.
Or to stop someone from leaving.
Or, just as often, to prevent bad optics, like a high-ranking resignation right before an election cycle. It reveals that the organizational structure was being used to serve political and personal needs, not the administrative functions of the court.
The testimony then moves into how this demanded loyalty was quickly weaponized in external conflicts. The clerk actively encouraged the deputy to escalate tensions with a specific judge. And this wasn't framed as professional communication aimed at, resolution or policy negotiation. The instructions, according to the testimony, were explicit. They were encouraging the deputy to push back, to hold their own, and to actively make the judge's life difficult.
And that's a critical distinction because it moves from a simple policy disagreement, which is normal in government, into intentional antagonism designed to destabilize a professional relationship.
Right.
The clerk's office and the judiciary are two sides of the same coin. They must cooperate for justice to function efficiently. Instructions to actively sabotage that relationship, as documented here, suggest a profound disregard for the functionality of the court system as a whole.
So what does that mean for the public, for the average person?
It means justice grinds to a halt. When the administrative backbone, the clerk's office, is actively engaging in antagonistic behavior with the judiciary, simple processes, from scheduling hearings to filing critical documents, they become political battles. And the person who pays the price is not the judge or the clerk. It's the victim or the defendant or the family whose case gets delayed or mishandled because the two essential parts of the court system cannot communicate professionally.
And the political demands, they quickly became an explicit abuse of public time. The testimony details mandatory campaign work that was performed on county time.
On the clock.
On the clock. Specific tasks included placing signs, attending campaign events, and fundraising. And the way they were coerced was direct and threatening. The deputy was given a clear warning that if the clerk lost the election, the deputy would lose their job.
So this is not leadership asking for support.
Not at all.
This is the leveraging of a constitutional office position to extract unpaid campaign labor under the threat of professional termination. This is perhaps one of the most serious ethical breaches detailed because it constitutes a direct misuse of public funds. The county taxpayer is paying staff wages while those employees are performing explicit campaign work. It fundamentally blurs the line between the constitutional office and the political campaign, and it fosters an environment where ethical conduct is replaced by survival instincts and loyalty tests.
And those loyalty tests, they quickly extended to targeting staff who weren't compliant. The chief deputy was explicitly instructed to find reasons to terminate employees who are not supporters of the clerk.
Wow.
So this isn't managing for performance. This is the active political cleansing of a civil service structure.
It is.
And compounding all this internal pressure and retaliation was chronic understaffing. Despite the office being described as drowning, the deputy reported they were prohibited from hiring new staff. Think about that operational paradox for a second. You have a 54% turnover rate, a hostile environment, and the person in charge of operations is forbidden from addressing the most fundamental operational need, which is staffing the desks.
And this confirms the link between the two core documents. The FAST-CT sheet noted the devastating 54% turnover. The 2017 account explains why the turnover was so high and why it was allowed to persist. It was a matter of political obstruction or maybe just deliberate neglect of resources.
Right.
Employees were leaving because of the hostility and mismanagement, and management was prohibited from stabilizing the situation through hiring. The entire system was basically set up to fail, leaving the remaining employees under this immense, unsustainable pressure.
The climax of this personal story is jarring. The moment of crisis happened when a judge threatened to issue a warrant for the clerk's arrest due to these escalating professional tensions. The immediate consequence for the writer of the testimony was swift and brutal. Sudden demotion, being physically moved out of their office, and completely cut off from communication.
And that just highlights a pattern of leadership that directs conflict, but actively avoids accountability. When the consequences of the directed antagonism making the judge's life difficult finally reached a critical, potentially criminal point.
The person who is following orders is the one who pays the price.
The person who executed the orders was immediately sacrificed by the leadership. It demonstrates that loyalty is conditional, and it only protects the person at the very top. And what's important to note is the speed of the fallout. The crisis was external, tied to a judicial conflict, yet the retaliation was immediate and internal. It was a clear warning to every single employee. If you follow orders and those orders result in high-level exposure or legal jeopardy for the clerk, you will be the one hung out to dry.
But the steep personal price paid by this high-ranking employee, it didn't end with the demotion. The stress from this environment, this relentless, toxic culture, it led directly to serious and documented health fallout for the writer, including suffering a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, or a mini stroke and chronic hypertension.
And that detail shifts the conversation beyond statistics and job dissatisfaction. It places it squarely in the realm of documented physical harm caused by professional negligence. A TIA is a serious, potentially life-threatening event. In high-stress, toxic work environments, we consistently see chronic physical conditions like hypertension and heart issues manifest. This isn't just someone feeling stressed out. This is a documented case of a professional environment causing severe, life-threatening physical harm to an employee who was just trying to keep the office running.
And ultimately, the final resignation came not due to performance issues, which the writer explicitly clarifies in their account, but because the environment became, in their words, unbearable. They left because the cost to their health, their well-being, their professional integrity, it was simply too high to bear.
So if we step back from the details, the key takeaway is just absolute, unsettling consistency. We have a highly detailed, consistent narrative of the office environment as it existed in 2017. And when we overlay this personal testimony, the mandated campaign work, the targeting of staff, the health crisis, onto the clinical evidence of the AFCT sheet, the 5 lawsuits, the 54% turnover, the racial bias documentation, the picture of a deeply systemically and chronically corrupted system becomes undeniable.
And this is where the true context really emerges. What happens when we stop treating these documents as separate evidence points and we start laying them side by side, as we've done here? When you take the 5 lawsuits, the 54% turnover statistic, the visceral personal testimony from the chief deputy, and that detailed 9-point FCT sheet, and you synthesize them all.
A pattern emerges.
A clear, multi-layered pattern of organizational failure emerges that connects all these diverse operational fields. This isn't random. This shows a persistent, intentional pattern. We see retaliation and fear being systematically used as management tools to enforce loyalty. We see the constant application of political loyalty tests that are prioritized over basic competence in hiring and retention.
Right.
We see racial bias confirmed by documented physical evidence. We see chronic mismanagement of fundamental operational duties, leading to record-breaking staff turnover. And crucially, we see a complete lack of personal accountability from the top, which forces the massive costs, both human and financial, onto the subordinates.
And this allows us to define the true anatomy of what we call institutional rot. This is fundamentally not about 1 or 2 poor decisions made in a vacuum. It is about a structure, a system of leadership and governance that was permitted to rot from the inside over many, many years. The core, essential function of the office was compromised not by a temporary error, but by persistent intent and neglect. And we also have to acknowledge the massive disparity between the external perception and the internal reality. For years, the public only saw the polished surface, an elected official holding a constitutional office. They were shielded from the reality of the 54% turnover rate, the internal hostility documentation, or the personal terror described by the deputies whose health was failing. This sustained disconnect between the surface appearance and the deep administrative corruption underneath is the definitive hallmark of long-term institutional failure.
And what was the actual price paid for maintaining that polished surface? The cost was borne almost entirely by the staff. The dedicated clerks, the deputies, the everyday workers who lived through it year after year. They paid with the loss of their jobs, with stalled careers and damaged professional trajectories. They paid with their physical health, including the chronic stress that led to the TIA and hypertension we saw documented in the 2017 testimony. And they paid with forced silence, operating in an atmosphere where speaking up meant immediate retaliation and demotion.
But the cost extends beyond the personnel. We have to frame the systemic consequence for you, the citizen. This mismanagement and massive turnover directly impacts the entire court system and every single person who relies on it daily. We're talking about victims of crime trying to seek justice, defendants trying to navigate due process, attorneys needing reliable and accurate records, and families depending on timely and correct filings. When the administrative backbone of the court, the clerk's office, is compromised by chronic mismanagement, everyone loses. The wheels of justice slow down, and public trust in the entire institution, the trust that the system will work for them, it just erodes rapidly.
So let's bring this discussion full circle and directly address the relevance to the current moment. Why should we revisit documents from 2017? Why are we discussing turnover data that started nearly 10 years ago, in 2014 especially right now, with the May primary and the August general election fast approaching?
The answer is that systemic patterns do not simply evaporate with time. They deepen. They become structural norms.
If a foundation is cracked, you don't evaluate its stability by looking at the fresh coat of paint on the walls today. You look at the original cracks. The history we have meticulously outlined here provides the essential deep context for evaluating the current state of the office and the qualifications of those who are seeking to lead it.
It's the why behind the what.
Exactly. Voters must understand the full history, not just the headlines and the campaign slogans of the moment. If the issues of politically driven nepotism, chronic absenteeism, documented racial bias, and severe staff retaliation were foundational and proven back in 2017, the question you have to ask is not if those patterns exist today, but how deeply entrenched they have become after years of continuation without any accountability.
This is where we need to be absolutely clear about the core issues that are at stake. This historical documentation proves that the debate in the upcoming election goes far beyond just standard political differences or, squabbling between opponents. The issues center on fundamental pillars of governance that affect every single citizen. First, there's the issue of public trust. When an office's history is revealed to include using taxpayer time for private business, coercing employees for campaign labor, and systematically retaliating against staff, the public's confidence in that office's basic ethical integrity it's shattered. Rebuilding that trust requires more than words. It requires a demonstrated reversal of these documented historical patterns.
And second, there's the integrity of a constitutional office. The Circuit Court Clerk's office is an essential, mandated constitutional function. It's required to operate fairly, legally, and without political bias. When historical documents clearly show that high-ranking officials were instructed to terminate staff for a lack of political loyalty or to actively antagonize the judiciary, the integrity of that constitutional function is fundamentally corrupted. The office ceases to be a nonpartisan pillar of justice and becomes a tool of political gain.
And third, and most practically, the integrity of critical infrastructure, the court system itself.
A whole system.
The court system cannot work effectively, impartially, or efficiently if its records office is suffering from a 54% turnover rate, constant internal hostility, and is led by individuals who are unable to explain basic functional processes. The historical evidence suggests the entire judicial ecosystem in this county has been operating on a severely strained, functionally compromised foundation for years.
So all of this detailed, consistent history that's laid bare in the FACT sheet and the 2017 testimony, it forces us to confront a simple central question, a question that you, the voter, must consider as you approach the ballot box. It is not just about the name of the person who holds the office, but what kind of operational standards, ethical expectations, and commitment to public service you demand from your leadership. So the ultimate question raised by these historical documents is this. After nearly a decade of documented dysfunction and operational neglect, what kind of leadership does Rutherford County want going forward? This has been Crisis in the Clerk's Office, Part 2. What we've done today is synthesize the sheer brutal consistency of the documentation presented, the clinical FET sheet, and the detailed 2017 account to establish that the crisis in this office is not a recent phenomenon. It is systemic, structural, and historical. As the May primary and the August general election proceed, we strongly encourage every listener to stay informed, stay engaged, and look closely at the documented historical record.
Because the past isn't just history. It is the context that explains the present. And here's a final thought for you to mull over as you conclude this deep dive. If systemic failure, documented hostility, and severe, measurable personal cost, up to and including a mini-stroke for a high-ranking official, were already evident and written down nearly a decade ago, how many current undisclosed challenges within the office are simply extensions of the exact same patterns documented in 2017? If the pattern is this long, what have been the cumulative hidden costs to the functionality of the institution and the public's access to justice? That is the real context that must inform your choice in the upcoming election cycle.